This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. It's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on January 5, 2025. It's part of our new series called This is the Way, the Path of Following Jesus. Let's hear the text from the New American Standard Bible. It's 2020 revision. I'll begin at verse 1 of Matthew chapter 2. The text tells us this. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for from you will come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him. After hearing the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went ahead of them, until it came to a stop over the place where the child was to be found. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after they came into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. After being warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. This is a classic story we read around the time of Christmas, and within the life of the church and its calendar, we usually read this text 2 weeks after Christmas, following the 12th day of Christmas. It's the text commonly used on January 6th. January 5 is called Epiphany Sunday because it's the Sunday prior to the actual feast of the Epiphany on January 6th. Now, this story is often considered part of the Christmas story, but it's actually somewhat apart from it. Now, the celebration of Epiphany on January 6th actually predates the observance of Christmas. In other words, Christians celebrated the Epiphany before they ever had an observance for Christmas. Christians simply adopted the Roman Saturnalia since they were off work during that time to create a Christmas holiday celebrating the birth of Jesus. So Jesus was likely born in the spring because that's the time when, as we know, shepherds watched their flock by night for births within their flock. So all apologies to the creche in your house, which has Mary, Joseph, animals, and an infant Jesus, along with the Magi. Verse 1 tells us that after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is the translation of Bethlehem out of Hebrew and English, literally means house of bread, was during the time of Herod the Great. Now, Herod was a vassal king of the Romans. He was half Judean and half Edomian, and he was a great builder. Herod the Great built structures all over the region of Judah, from Caesarea Maritima, which was the palace he built for the Roman governor, to, of course, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem itself. But as Herod the Great aged, he became more and more paranoid. As his building projects got larger, he enslaved Jews to do his work. He hoarded funds and became quite corrupt. Now, we know that his reign ended in 4 BC. So that's 4 years, of course, before the year 0. So that we know that if Jesus was born and was even alive a year or two during the time of Herod the Great, Jesus had to have been born before the year 4 BC. Well, why not 0? It's a kind of a common question people have, but they may not know the answer to. Well, you can blame Dionysius Exiguus. He was the one who created the calendar that we currently use that has dates ranging from AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, to BC, before Christ, on the calendar. But when he created that calendar back in the 6th century, he wrongly computed Jesus' birth using a solar calendar instead of a lunar calendar, and that's how you get all messed up. So instead of Jesus being born at 0, Jesus is actually born probably around 4 BC. Now, Magi arrived from the east. And there's lots of conjecture here about who these people are. Our word today, for example, magic, is directly connected to this word Magi, and it comes from the same root word. They were likely some kind of astrologers who used the stars as signs of divination, probably Zoroastrian. And you've probably noticed so far in this podcast, when I say their name, I call them the Magi, because that's probably how it was correctly pronounced rather than Magi. So just think of the M-A, the A there as being a long A rather than a short A, so Magi. Now, they saw the star, assuming that it must have been over the capital city of Israel, which is Jerusalem. Bethlehem, after all, is only 5 miles away from Jerusalem, so it seems likely that they assumed that the capital is the birthplace for a king. So when they saw this star appear in the sky, they came to worship him. They came more than likely from Babylon. And the reason being is that in Babylon, there was a strong Jewish presence over hundreds of years. Jews who were descendant from the exiles taken there by King Nebuchadnezzar way, way, way back in the 7th and 6th century. So those Jewish communities knew what this meant. They knew that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. They knew that the signs of the times. And so the Magi were likely informed by their Jewish community that this was going to happen. Now, it wasn't uncommon in the ancient world, though, for Magi to show up whenever a king was born. We have records showing us that when different kings or regions were born in different regions around the Persian world and even parts of the Roman world, the Magi showed up as a sign of homage to whoever that new king or regent happened to be. And what's interesting here in Matthew's gospel is that this is the gospel's way of pointing to the fact that the Gentiles will hear the good news as well. They'll hear the message of Jesus. The Magi are indeed Gentiles, and so the good news is for them as well. And along with it, that the Messiah, of course, would be rejected by his own, Herod. The Magi hear the message, somewhat symbolically representing the Gentiles coming, but yet Jesus' own people, represented by Herod, did not recognize him. This opens a key passageway to us, that the hand and heart of God are working where we least expect it. The hand and heart of God are working where we least expect it. The irony of this story is that Herod and those he will consult shortly miss the Messiah. Magi are from the east and are the ones in the story who hear the good news and they obey. We call January 6th the Epiphany. The word epiphany means appearing. And we call it that for a reason. Jesus has appeared symbolically in the star to the Magi and to Herod. But only the Magi act in obedience. And the same is true for us. Jesus is recognized by those ready for his reign to come within them. The story now moves to the center of the conversation that takes place between the Magi and between Herod. In verses 3 through 8, we really have kind of a clash of two kings. Verse 3 opens with Herod being a bit concerned about this question of location of the one who is born king of Israel. After all, at least in Herod's own mind, the king of Israel is literally standing in front of the Magi. So if the Magi come asking where the king is, well, they're kind of making their implicit commentary on Herod's kingship. Now, if Herod feels threatened, that's normally bad for any king. But in this late stage of life, with all of the abuses that Herod had dished out on the Jewish people, you can understand why the whole city was concerned, not just Herod. So Herod gathers together religious leaders, it says the chief priests and the scribes, to ask where the child would be born. And in some ways, this is an indictment of him. We know that even the most casual Jews in the ancient world in that first century knew that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, but Herod didn't know this. So Herod, most interestingly, who's the king of Judah, has no clue where the Messiah is to be born. The chief priests and the scribes told him that Bethlehem is the location, and they quote from the prophet Micah. And the reason Bethlehem is significant is because this is the city or the town from which King David came from when Saul went looking for the king of Israel that would follow, that Samuel went to Bethlehem to find the next king of Israel after King Saul was now going to be replaced. So David, of course, being kind of the stereotypical king of Israel, it was predicted through the prophets that the Messiah who would come, namely what Micah describes, is also going to come from Bethlehem as well. So Herod then asks the Magi an important question of timing, and he wants to know when the star appeared. Now, when he asked him this, he did so privately. He didn't necessarily want the priest and the scribes to hear this conversation, so he pulls the Magi aside and asks when they saw the star. Now, the journey the Magi had to take in order to get there from Babylon was lengthy. It wasn't a matter of days or weeks. It was months or maybe even a year or more. It would take the Magi from the appearance of the star to get there. They have to go all the way around the Fertile Crescent. In other words, they have to come north out of what is today modern-day Iraq, go almost all the way up to the Black Sea near where Turkey is, and then come back down to the south. It took a long time to take the journey that they had to take. So this is how we know that Jesus was no newborn when the story takes place. And this rewinds us back to the creche you may have in your house of the Nativity. You should also take note of how later in this chapter, when Herod finds out the Magi have betrayed him, he orders all the male children in Bethlehem under the age of 2 to be killed. Jesus, when this story takes place, is probably not a newborn infant in his swaddling clothes being held by Mary. Jesus is more than likely a toddler when this story happens. And then Herod tells the Magi that they're to leave, and when they go and they find where this king of Israel is born and is, they should return to him to give him the exact location. Of course, this is a lie. Herod the Great has no nation to come and worship the child. Herod intends to murder the child. And that gives us all a bit of a key passageway here, that Herod represents every place in us where Christ does not rule. This is a hard truth for us to hear, that Herod represents every place in us where Christ does not rule. You see, Herod, he has no interest in exalting Jesus as king. He sees Jesus only as threat to his power. Herod doesn't want Jesus to rule since it would impede his own rule. So before we cast aside Herod the Great as just the villain of the story, we must take care to examine our own lives. Where in our lives does Jesus rule? Where does he not? What are we doing about it? Because in this tale of 2 kings in this story between Jesus and Herod, only one can be the true king, and that is Jesus. Finally, we turn to verses 9 through 12, and we find the focus not on Herod any longer, but the focus is on the Magi's journey to find Jesus in Bethlehem. So our focus is not on the 2 kings, but on the one king. Now, following their secret conversation with Herod, the Magi set out on their way for the short journey to Bethlehem. Bethlehem is just down the road, about 5.5 miles. It's very close to Jerusalem. The star which they followed from Babylon to come to Jerusalem, has now moved with them until it stopped over the place Jesus was. So when they saw the star, the text says they rejoiced. The language here is a bit peculiar. It's the highest form of rejoicing. Notice how the text phrases it in Matthew 2. They rejoiced with exceedingly great joy, supreme joy, this great joy of having found the person that they had been seeking all along. It says that they came into the house. Now, it's a passing phrase, but it helps us understand that Mary and Joseph are no longer in a manger, but rather they're in a home now in Bethlehem. There's no mention of Joseph in this story. It says they see Mary with the child. She says nothing in the story. And at the same time, Jesus says nothing. You might be saying, well, of course Jesus says nothing. But it was a common myth in the ancient world that when there was some kind of great story of a miraculous birth, the child would have this kind of magical capacity to speak, even as an infant or as a toddler. And there's none of that in this story. And its absence is significant, that there's a sense in which this miraculous birth isn't like anything else that's ever been seen. When the Magi arrived, the text tells us that they fell down and worshiped him. Again, this is a key moment for the Gentile mission. It's in a sense the Magi are foreshadowing the work of the proclamation of the gospel to the Gentiles. They come and they bow and they worship him. This would be different than what the Magi would do when they honored other regents or kings. They would fall down, they would bring their gifts, but here they worship him. There's this acknowledgement of who Jesus is, and this is such a key moment in the story. Herod seeks to kill the child, but the Magi, who are not Jewish, who are not from Israel, who are not residents of Jerusalem, who are not priests, who are not scribes, they're the ones who recognize him. They bowed to worship him. And it says that they bring 3 gifts. Now, I just want to note in passing that unlike the song we normally sing this time of year called We Three Kings of Orient Are, that doesn't mean there were 3 of them. So they're not 3, they're not kings. And the word Orient or Oriental means east or eastward, whereas Occidental means westward. So it's Magi from the east is what the Bible tells us they are. It doesn't say they're kings. It doesn't say anything else. Just they brought 3 gifts with them, though. So the assumption is there were 3 of them, each bringing 1 gift. We have no idea how many Magi there are, but they did bring 3 gifts. The first one, gold. Gold was, of course, a royal adornment. It signified wealth and power. Frankincense was typically burned as incense. It was used in royal homes. It was used in other religious duties. It was used for a whole variety of purposes, including being used as part of priestly orders and sacrificial offerings. And then there's myrrh. Myrrh was an oil or ointment used to anoint kings, and it was also used for rituals with preparing the dead for burial. So oftentimes people read a lot into these 3 symbols that the Magi bring, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. In some ways, it's best for us to just focus on what these elements mean in their simplicity and not try to overcomplicate them. All 3 of these elements have something in common, and what they have in common is that they were commodities usually held and used by kings. Now, there's more myth read into these items than there is substance. There's great stories that these Magi actually have names, and that these 3 gifts, they each represent something about the very ministry of Jesus. The gold, meaning that Jesus is a king, the frankincense, that he's a priest, and that the myrrh, that he is going to die sacrificially. I suppose those meanings are there within each of these 3 words, but sometimes our desire to find more meaning in a text is trying to bring something into the text that may not actually be there. And for me, I would just simply say, let it be as simple as it is. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, these are all signs of Jesus's regal position, his kingship, The very thing that the Magi have come to do is to honor him as king and to worship him. So what's interesting here is that the Magi, like Joseph has, and as Joseph will, they hear in a dream that they're not to return to Herod. So they left by another way. So instead of going back to Jerusalem for their travel back east, they leave a different way and then they bypass Jerusalem altogether. Well, of course, if you keep reading the text, when Herod finds out the Magi have deceived him and left, he's enraged. And you can read the rest of the story in Matthew chapter 2 of what happens. But all of this event where the Magi arrive in Bethlehem and honor Jesus is a key passageway for us. That there is only one true king, leader, and Lord, and his name is Jesus. Note how Jesus' presence provokes the Magi to bow and worship. They didn't do any of that when they met Herod. They met Herod, and he was just simply an individual to ask for directions. They give these gifts to Jesus and their worship to Jesus because he's the only one worthy of it. So when we consider our own gifts and our own resources, they too must point to Jesus, just like the Magi's gifts did. There's only one who's worthy to receive such things. You know, the contrast in the story between Herod and Jesus, these two kings, is rich. And the Magi are kind of the vehicle for this. They clearly see who is worthy of their worship and gifts, and we should too. If you have comments or reflections, I invite you to visit my website, revcraig.com. Click on News on the upper right-hand corner, and on the drop-down menu, select Podcast, and then click on this week's episode and leave a comment. I also want to give you a quick programming note that First Free Methodist Church of Seattle has opened a new podcast that you can find on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and the podcast we have there has weekly sermons from First Free Methodist Church as well as passages, this podcast. So both sermon and this podcast in one place at the same time. Of course, you can find the podcast on my own website, revcraig.com, but you can also find it by searching for FFMC on any of your podcast apps, and you'll find our podcast. Please subscribe to it, and you'll always be up to date receiving weekly podcasts called Passages and our other episode for Sunday sermons too. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. I also encourage you to visit our church's website, ffmc.org, to learn more about Free Methodism, its rich history and tradition, and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.